Hey guys, Curious Monkey here. Today we're going to talk about the anatomy of the middle ear. So, the anatomy of the middle ear consists of the three main parts, that is the external ear, that consists of the pinna and the external auditory canal. And the second part is the middle ear, and the innermost part is the inner ear. So, the middle ear is divided into three main parts. That is, if this is the tympanic membrane, and this is the pars flaccida, and this is the pars tensa. So at the level of the pars tensa, this is known as mesotympanum, and this is known as epitympanum, and here it is known as hypotympanum, below the level of the pars tensa. So it is the epitympanum above the level of the pars tensa, at the level is mesotympanum, and below is the hypotympanum. So these are the three main cavities or like parts of the middle ear cavity. Now, middle ear cavity is like a box-shaped structure which has 6 sides. Okay, so let's talk about the lateral side, that is the outer side first. The lateral side is composed mainly of the tympanic membrane and the bony structure. This bony structure is known as scutum. Okay, so the scutum and the tympanic membrane, both of it make up the lateral wall of the middle ear. Now, opposite to the lateral wall of the middle ear is the medial wall, right? So now towards the inner side of the medial wall of the ear, what we see is the inner ear. The inner ear has a snail-like structure like this, right? So this snail-like structure is known as the cochlea. So this cochlea is providing a bulge or a prominence on the medial wall. So this bulge, if this is the medial wall, if this is the medial wall, it's producing a bulge-like structure like this. So this is known as the promontory. And here is the oval window. As you can see here, the stapes is going to be attached, and here is the oval window, and below it is the round window, and here there's a prominence of a semicircular canal. So this semicircular canal is going to be the lateral semicircular canal. Why? Because as you can see here in this picture, the inner ear has 3 semicircular canals: the superior, posterior, and the lateral. So the lateral, as the name suggests, is facing towards the lateral. It's going towards the lateral side, and lateral of the inner ear is the middle ear, right? So because of that, it is going to give a prominence on the medial wall of the middle ear. So now that is it, and let's say this is the internal acoustic meatus. So exiting through the internal acoustic meatus is facial nerve. When the facial nerve enters the middle ear, it takes a turn. This turn is known as genu, and as it is the first one, so it's known as the first genu, right? So the facial nerve, after taking the first turn, travels like this, like horizontally, so it is known as the horizontal segment of the facial nerve. Now it comes towards the posterior wall of the middle ear, and then it takes a second turn. So second turn means second genu, right? And then this part is the vertical part. So this is known as the vertical segment of the facial nerve. Now here there is a important structure known as processus cochleariformis, right? So why is this important is because of two things. First is because it is a surgical landmark for the indication of this first genu. So this processus cochleariformis, when we do surgery, tells us where the first genu is located. That is one of the functions, or like the main things about the processus cochleariformis. And the second thing is that, as we know, the middle ear cavity contains 2 muscles. Out of them, one is tensor tympani. Tensor tympani. So this tensor tympani, it comes from the anterior wall towards the medial wall, and this processus cochleariformis acts like a hook. Okay, so the tensor tympani hooks onto it like this and turns towards the anterior side, if the camera is the anterior side, so it turns towards the anterior side, and there it goes and attaches to the malleus. And as the name suggests, tensor tympani, so it helps in tensioning, like tensioning because of this pulling structure. It helps in tensioning the tympanic membrane. So that is one of the functions of the processus cochleariformis. Just remember that. And coming on to the posterior wall, if this is the medial wall and this is the posterior wall, right? So this is the facial nerve. Medial towards the vertical segment of the facial nerve on the posterior wall of the middle ear cavity, there lies a structure known as the pyramid. Okay, so this pyramid is important. Why? Because it gives out a structure known as Stapedius muscle. This is the second muscle after tensor tympani we are seeing. So this is known as the Stapedius muscle. So why is this Stapedius muscle important? Is because it goes and attaches to the stapes here. Now this attachment to the stapes gives a function to it, that is the stapedial reflex. Okay, this is one of the main functions of the Stapedius muscle. So that is one of the structure, the pyramid. And moving on to the next structure, that is the fossa indicis. Now what is this fossa indicis? This fossa indicis, as we can see here, the three ossicles, the malleus, the incus and the stapes, right? The malleus in the incus, as you can see, there is a bony projection like this, right? This is known as the short process. This bony like projection here, it's known as the short process. Now if you say that this, my hand, is the posterior wall, right? If this is the posterior wall and this is the incus and this is the short process, so it's laying like this. Okay, it rests on the posterior wall. So for it to rest there is a fossa, that is the fossa indicis, right? So now for this, coming back to the facial nerve, when the facial nerve exits from the stylomastoid foramen, right? Before it doing that, it gives off a branch known as cauda tympani. Now this cauda tympani comes back into the middle ear cavity through the posterior wall here. Okay, so that is one of the main things. And because superiorly it's the fossa indicis and laterally it's the cauda tympani and medially it's the facial nerve. So this space is known as the facial recess. Now why is this facial recess important? Is because for us to enter the middle ear cavity, right, we cannot enter directly from the tympanic membrane during surgery, so we can't do that. So what we do is we enter the mastoid air cell first and then we enter the middle ear cavity through this facial recess, right? So that is one of the main importance for this facial recess. Now as we all know, this is the aretus and connected to it is the antrum, which is connected to the mastoid air cell. So now as we can see, this facial nerve is covered by a whole bony canal. Okay, it's known as the fallopian canal. Okay, so now if you say that this is the posterior wall, like this is the posterior wall and this thing is the vertical segment of the facial nerve. Now because of this vertical segment of the facial nerve, we are not able to see this part of the posterior wall. It's getting blocked by the vertical segment of the facial nerve, right? So this part which gets blocked, the view blocked, is called the sinus tympani, right? So why is this important again is because when we do surgeries, right, when we do surgeries of the middle ear cavity, when we remove all the disease like structures, so as we cannot see, this view is blocked by the facial nerve canal. So because of that reason, some of the parts gets remained behind, and because of this there can occur recurrence. Okay, recurrence can occur, so it's not a good thing. So that is one of the main points here. Now moving on to the anterior wall, as we said that the facial nerve before exiting is giving out a nerve known as the chorda tympani, right? So the chorda tympani enters the middle ear cavity through the posterior wall and goes towards the anterior wall and exits from the anterior wall. Okay, so the exit, where it exits, is known as the foramen of Huggier. Okay, foramen of Huggier. Now, as I said that the tensor tympani comes from the anterior wall of the middle ear cavity, right? So here, this part is where the tensor tympani comes out from, and here is another structure for the tympanic eustachian tube. Sorry. Now moving on to the last two walls, that is the roof and the floor. Now roof and the floor is made out of thin bones. Okay, thin bones. Now the roof is known as the tegmen tympani, and the floor and the roof and the floor separates it both from like cavities. Okay, so the roof separates the middle ear cavity from the middle cranial fossa. Okay, and the floor separates it from the jugular bulb. Now the importance is that if the floor is damaged, then the jugular bulb will get damaged. There's a chance. And if the roof is damaged, then CSF will leak out from the roof, and it might leak out from the ear also.